Hi, my name is Leif. I work for the University of Alaska Fairbanks. You heard a little bit about that. We're going to talk about the built environment today. We're going to move a little bit fast through some of these slides. I know it's right after lunch. I promise you we'll get through this. It will be painless. You'll learn some things. We're going to be talking about the built environment and human activity today. My background is I have a public health degree. I'm a residential environmental health specialist and a healthy home specialist. So a lot of what I do is in residential, but when we talk about the built environment, just real basic stuff here, that's all of the things around us. Right now, we're in a built environment. When we talk about the built environment in health in the professional setting, we'd also be talking about things like air quality or lead poisoning from pipes or traffic accidents, those sorts of things. But today, we're going to narrow that in. We're going to talk a little bit about human activity, right? Healthy activities, healthy behaviors, that sort of thing. That's Milwaukee, if anyone's curious. So it's pretty most of us probably have a handle on this idea of how the built environment can affect health. If you live in a place with no sidewalks, you would probably be less likely to walk around after school or walk to work, that sort of thing. So this is, a picture of a community that doesn't have those things. If you don't have a baseball diamond, you're probably not going to learn to play baseball. It's going to be harder to do those things, right? And so most of us have an intuitive sense for that. And so the idea is that if we look at situations where this built environment is lacking and doesn't support healthy activity, the next step to that is, well, how could we change that? How could we build it to nudge people towards healthier behaviors? Just a example of that locally, if anyone ever is over Russian Jack Park, they're changing the way the bike lanes go because people always park in the bike paths and it's a whole hassle. So they're doing a little experiment there to see if they can change behavior and hopefully encourage more people to use the bike paths by doing that. So if you're over there, check it out. So we can definitely build infrastructure that doesn't support healthy activity, and we can do some things to improve it when it does. A big thrust of what we're going to be talking about today is that there are limitations to that. That many of these problems we can't build our way out of. And so there is a necessary connection between the built environment and humans who leverage those environments. So this is a picture of a playground, right? So does building more playgrounds just make people healthier? Does building more ski trail just make people healthier? If we build another 20 miles of bike path in Anchorage, is that going to make more bikers, or are the people who are already biking just going to be the ones that use it? So I'm going to throw this hypothesis out here early so that you can absorb it and you can agree with it or disagree with it. But this is what we're going to be talking about, is this idea that a favorable built environment is necessary but not sufficient. There are limitations to this. So if we build a gym, does that get people to go to the gym? If we build a trail system or a garden, does that get people to do those things? Or does that capture people who are already interested in those activities? And what I would like you to believe by the end of our time up here is that human capital, human investment in that physical infrastructure is a much more important driver of behavior change in the community. I'll say that a few times throughout this, a couple different ways. Here's my piece on this, and here's how I got involved with this topic. I run the community garden in Bethel. That's me and a carrot. So I got asked this question, right? I mean, we're doing a lot of work at the university on community gardening and getting people, ag hort, getting people out there in the gardens. So Leif, is this actually impacting health status in community? Is it doing anything? Why are we doing this thing? And I wanted to look at this topic in a in a focused way, in a methodical way. Is that really true? We all have an idea gardening has to be good for you, right? So if we build gardens, does that make healthy people? Well, that's a different question. That's a big jump. So I looked at literature that was available. I also called around a lot. I talked to my colleagues. I talked to people who gardened around the state. I talked to people who used to garden, different communities. And unsurprisingly, looking at a review of the literature, it said a lot of the things you might expect. People who garden tend to eat more vegetables. Okay, people who garden tend to spend more time outdoors. Well, that makes sense. There wasn't as good of evidence saying that putting a garden in a community changed behavior, right? If we build a garden, all of a sudden people show up and start eating vegetables and changes their life. The other thing that came out of the literature that's relevant for this, it's part of a much bigger presentation, people who benefit have some sort of deficiency. Right? So if you put a community garden right next to the other community garden, or you make the community garden twice as big, it doesn't double the impact. So you have to start with people who have a deficiency. There's nothing else there, and you go from zero to something. Also, it has to be the people who are actually involved. So if I have a community garden in Bethel, and I get with the families, and you kind of everybody involved in those families, say that's 60 people out of 6,000, 1%, right? So it doesn't do a good job helping the 99% of people who do not participate. So that's kind of the math that we're working with. So when you talk to people about, and I did, why don't you have a community garden? We all have a good idea that this seems like a good thing. Why don't you? Initially, people were concerned about space and money. We can't do that here. We don't have any money. What do you need money for, right? And when you drill down a little bit, it seemed like human resources were almost universally what limited success. It's what supported gardens that work, and it was missing in gardens that failed. Characteristics of successful gardens. Again, this was all just me calling and asking. These are not my values or my opinions. I wrote it down. Seemed to be run by specific people. It wasn't the community was in charge of the garden. They could point at somebody. Go talk to him. He's the gardener. One or two champions in the community, people that made this work every year, that closed the gap on this, and participation of people who were experienced. So most of the characteristics of gardens that were successful had to do with people. Didn't hear a lot about, well, after we got this great facility, that's when gardening really took off. Why did gardens fail? So this is the opposite question. Hey, I know you guys used to have a garden out there. I saw there was, old rototiller that was rusting. What happened? Loss of key individuals was almost always the case. Sometimes this was institutional. Well, there used to be a school program, or there used to be a church program, and that went away. Sometimes it was just individuals. Joe died, and after that, we stopped. So again, really came back to lack of volunteers, lack of people. Nobody said we had this vibrant gardening community until our greenhouse burned down, and then everybody quit, right? So it didn't seem like it was an infrastructure issue for those failures. So quick story, tale of two gardens here. I put Village X, but it happened more than once, so you can fill in the blanks. Teacher moves out to a village, says, hey, you know what? It's really hard to get produce here. Why doesn't anyone garden? You guys should do this, right? You guys should do this. And you know what? I'm going to help you out. I'm going to get a grant for you, and we're going to get you set up. So this is going to change your lives. So, teacher goes out, gets a grant for $10,000 or $20,000 to build a greenhouse, right? Not that greenhouse, but it might as well be, right? It might be inappropriate for the setting and the commitment that we have from the people in that community. So didn't really involve, it wasn't a lot of buy-in locally, right? But infrastructure heavy. So we have the facility to have very robust gardening program here. And then what happens? Well, summer happens, right? That teacher leaves on the teacher flight. I don't know if anyone's been to, and they're gone all summer. And then what happens to this? Well, nobody really was after it anyways. There's a certain amount of work, a certain learning curve to doing these things. You put a giant glass greenhouse next to a school with no one supervising it. What does that glass greenhouse look like at the end of the summer, right? And it doesn't work. And we end up in a spot that was worse than we started. Hey, have you guys ever considered gardening? We tried that here and it didn't work, right? So we actually made things worse with this infrastructure project. So counter example here, Bethel Community Garden, it's not the best one. It's just the one that I know the most about. Also, it's probably the best one. So we did things learned from that, hopefully. Did things a little bit different. Started as a partnership between groups of people who were already doing this work, who were what I call hands in the dirt, right? People who were going to be doing this. And it was expansion of an existing community garden program. So we knew we were starting with something. We had some human investment in this. Diabetes program paid for their fencing. How did we know that we needed fencing? That was our big piece of infrastructure that we had to pay for. It was expensive. It's like a $20,000 fence. Because we talked to people and asked them, and they said vandalism is our big thing we're worried about. We don't want to garden here because there's going to be vandalism. So the infrastructure followed the human input, not the other way around, right? We didn't build it and then see who showed up. The city agreed to move dirt, and we started that planning, and it was a lot of work, and that's what the garden looked like, and it was a lot of meetings. Everybody loves meetings. Now it would all be on Zoom, probably. It'd be even worse. So we did these community meetings, and we did these radio announcements, and we had to talk about all these things. Well, are we going to have individual plots? Are we going to be an organic garden? What are we going to do? And we didn't know until we talked to people, right? So we found out, and that gave us some guidance on what kind of an infrastructure investment we needed, what kind of stuff we needed to make this work. And we arranged for a master gardener class, because that was another thing that came up. This is a guy who was the grant writer for the city of Bethel and also a gardener. So that was important, right? So we could have done this project with less infrastructure. We couldn't have done it without some key people. It wouldn't have worked. It's me and my carrot again. So it took time and it took people, and I was the guy that assigned plots and dealt with unhappy gardeners and had to do some of the administrative work that was attached to that, which is time and it's money and it's investment. Because we had that, though, remember I talked about that 1% of people actually participating in the garden, right? There was champions for that garden then. So we were able to get school groups in there. So we were able to expand this benefit to people beyond those that just would have showed up and were probably already gardening at their house anyways, right? So we were able to expand on that, get some youth groups in there. We were also able to develop partnerships. If we just built a fence and said, boom, we're done, that doesn't help us get partnerships that help us be successful and leverage that physical space. So I can brag about the garden all day long. Catch me sometime, I will. But these are the things that I feel like we did a good job on. And I point to this list and I'd say, look at that list and say, what could we have done that with less infrastructure? Absolutely. If we had twice as much infrastructure, would that double our, right? Is that what was important here? And I'd say, no, these are all related to people. We could have done it with much less money and much less stuff as long as we had the people. And if we had twice as much stuff and it was twice as big, but we didn't have people, it would be a rusted rototiller and a torn down fence, and it would be empty. So what came out of this project that I did, calling around and looking at the research and talking to people and talking to colleagues, was that investment in people is actually very important. So I got asked to do a talk on built environment and took it. Thank you for coming with me on that. I took a little bit of a turn there, but I think it's important to say that the built environment only works when we have people who can leverage that. Right? These are all people related. People are what make gardens successful. So with that, I will turn it over.
Cool. Thank you, Leif. Or Leif, I'm so sorry. Anyway, my name is Tyler. I'm with Skiku. For those of you who aren't aware, Skiku is a nonprofit that operates through much of rural Alaska, and we provide youth outreach opportunities and role modeling and all manner of awesome fun through the sport of cross-country skiing. In the days before COVID, we went to about 50 communities. Last year, we went to about 30, and so we see a wide portion of Alaska. Going with Leif's discussion about built environment and the necessity of human capital, I'm going to take a very similar tangent and kind of use some illustrations that we've seen throughout the state in our travels as well. And so I'm going to kind of just glance on this. I think we're all aware of the health benefits of aerobic activity. Cross-country skiing is an excellent aerobic activity. It does get you outside. It gets the heart rate up. It's a great lifelong sport. You don't need teams or anything like that. And despite skis being a bit expensive, it is a relatively low cost to entry. Once you've got skis, they're pretty much good for life, and you can roll with that as you may. And they don't necessitate built trails, right? So let's kind of keep that in mind as well. And so when we talk about ski needs, there is, the gears, the boots, the poles, the clothes, plus terrain, right? You've got to have something skiable, and there's got to be snow. So for my friends maybe in Southeast Alaska, it's a bit harder, right? Not quite as solid winters, a bit cliffier terrain. Whereas much of kind of anywhere north of South Central has a lot of rolling terrain, right? A lot of nice forests and big wide rivers that we can be skiing down across, all that good stuff. Other things that we need that are a little less tangible, right? They're kind of hard to touch. A passionate coach. And these coaches don't need to be elite world star athletes. They can be positive role models who know how to work a set of bindings. Okay. This is also kind of key with our built discussion, right? And also less tangible, very much less tangible, an active minded community. And so what we're talking about here is the people you're surrounding yourself with are also kind of into doing some outdoorsy type things. Maybe we're not all playing Fortnite. Maybe we're just playing Fortnite a little bit, right? And so kind of, well, what's going on here? So in the past, especially along the Yukon and Kuskokwim rivers, and to this day in the Bering Straits region, many of these communities had very active and robust ski programs. So this is a photo, if you can see the font, in 1983. As I perused this yearbook I found in Kayakuk, there were countless pages of communities from wide stretches of river coming together for meets, having good community get-togethers, all while providing positive athletic opportunities for kids and adults alike. Okay? These programs began to fall away, and in speaking with people, very similar to gardening, what happens 9 times out of 10 is Joe Bob moved, Sally passed away, somebody left the community that was their coach, and nobody was willing to take that mantle on afterwards, and those programs essentially fell apart. And this is kind of happening also like in real time with Bering Straits, we're seeing this. So I know 5 years ago when I would go to the Bering Straits, there were many very passionate coaches that were super into the sport, even if they themselves were new to it. When I've spoken with some of those communities more recently in the past year or so, many of their coaches have left and they have no program because they have no driver for it. Okay? And so there is a perception of Alaska is a perfect place for cross-country skiing, right? It's got rolling hills and we have a ton of snow. But the reality is we have plenty of gear and plenty of stoke for kids, but what's missing is that that human capital portion. And so we could throw all the skis we want somewhere, but does that necessarily make healthier youth and more engaged aerobic participants, right? Well, maybe not. If there's nobody to bring kids out skiing or to drive a love of the outdoors, that piece is missing. And so what we can think about in this missing piece is that human capital piece, right? You can take a lifelong passionate skier, and that could be, you know, ideally it's a community member, but it could be just someone who's really into it, like I'm pretty into it. When we travel to rural communities, you know, we're introducing kids and hopefully instilling a love of the sport for them as well. And ideally, this is kind of a wheel that begins to spin where those kids that have started skiing 2nd grade, 3rd grade, well, by the time they're in high school, maybe they're still keeping it up because it's fun. It's a good way to engage with other nearby communities to see friends. And through that, maybe they're more into competition. Don't have to be, could just be into it because it's fun to go on your trap line on your skis. And then those high schoolers, what we see very commonly at Skiku is that they want to share their knowledge with younger peers, right? And so maybe those high schoolers are helping those 2nd graders. And as you keep starting to spin that wheel a little more and a little more, well, then those high schoolers become adults and maybe they have kids and maybe they share a passion for a sport. Sport could be cross-country skiing, could be running, something healthy though, right? And what the driver really is the passion of that individual as opposed to, well, there's no skis somewhere, let's ship 50 sets, let's build them a rack and call it a day. Good job. Right? That's not necessarily the case. And so there are price tags associated, right? And some are a lot more clear and more transparent than others. And so when we're talking about physical infrastructure, somebody's got to build it. I got to go build a bunch of ski racks. I got to buy a bunch of lumber. I need a drill. Okay, that's not too bad. It's a little bit maybe higher cost, especially if we're building a big greenhouse, a $20,000 fence. But what we also have to consider is the human capital, right? And those have their own pros and cons. We really have to invest time into that individual. So for the example of a ski coach or a gardener, somebody that can put their bindings on is pretty good, but really you need to teach somebody how to fall correctly and get up, how to move a little more gracefully than perhaps the shovel. You have to invest in that coach type person or that master gardener to give them the skills they need. And we see this a lot Coaches even here in the Anchorage Bowl, be it in ASD or Junior Nordic, other programs, I see it all the time. Coaches want training. They want to feel confident in themselves. And when they feel good about their ability to instruct, they're much better able to pass that on to their skiers or their students or their athletes, right? And so there's a lot of good benefits that the human capital brings besides that. That's jobs potentially, good role models, and they're folks that live in their community. I think this is a key portion too. And so, you can have kind of through putting some of these points together, poorly built environments can impact in the case of some of these other greenhouses that were not the Bethel one, right, where it's doing more harm than good. In a similar way, you could have I've seen, in a lot of communities, I don't know how many rural community PE locker rooms you've been to. I've been to a lot. There's a fair amount of sports equipment that is pristine, but collecting inches of dust. And so, was it a value to order all those lacrosse sticks because that one teacher was really into lacrosse? Or was it worth it to get football gear because that one person was really into football? Maybe it would have been better if we could have invested in a coach who was into a sport that was long-term within the community. And overall, maybe that would have saved us money than buying all this kind of not random, but semi-random equipment. And so some examples of infrastructure versus the human capital side of things. So this is a picture I got from Leif a couple days ago. He was at a cyclocross race. And so all these folks turned up for a race, and they were all racing on trails. And so we can think of trails as built infrastructure too, right? Do we need ski trails? That's good. But would we still go skiing if we didn't have them? Probably. And so all these folks probably would have been out biking anyway, but would they have come together as a community kind of en masse if it wasn't for the existence of that human capital piece of their race director driving that event, bringing everyone together? And I think you could point to a lot of sporting events. I don't know if anyone here skis the Tour of Anchorage, would you come ski the Tour of Anchorage if it existed not as an event? Would you ski from Hillside to Kincaid just for funsies? Maybe, maybe not. But with somebody putting that event together, that brings a lot more people in on it, right? And a lot more buy-in on that trail system. So anyway, there's some more examples there. Is this a waste of time to build environment? Definitely not. I mean, you've got to have some type of infrastructure. But when you're talking about making significant changes that are meaningful, you've got to have a human capital aspect to it. Local leaders are ideal, at least for us, I imagine for Leif as well. Local folks that are well invested, that know their community. They know that there's moose around, whereas somebody else that's writing a third-party grant maybe isn't aware of moose. Local knowledge is super key in these pieces. Which also kind of brings you to the question of, well, why do we keep investing in the stuff instead of the people? It's kind of easier, right? It's easy to build a building relatively than it is for me to teach a coach in often cases. It's easier to build a ski rack than it is for me to instruct skate skiing and then have somebody teach skate skiing to a kid. So much more challenging. It's also really easy to touch a ski rack. It is not that easy to touch quality coaching or a quality garden. And you can make pretty clear statements about your building. It's harder to make those statements about an individual, especially if maybe like you're friends with them, something like that. And so kind of through that, we can use that knowledge of building up our people in tandem to supplement building our built infrastructure. You really can't have one without the other. And they really, for effective change and for effective use of resources, they've really got to go hand in hand. Just like Leif's talking about, we got with the community first to discuss what the Bethel Garden should look like. If I'm going to go run a ski program or I'm going to propose somewhere to start a ski club, as opposed to top down directing that, you've really got to bring in the stakeholders that are on the ground. And so it's kind of an ancillary part to that. When we're talking about when we do want to build something, there are some important considerations to put in. So like, what is the goal of this construction? Is the goal to have a garden, or is the goal to drive healthy changes? Is the goal to put more skiers in the woods, or is the goal to have more healthy athletes? Okay? Who's it designed for? Is it for the folks that are already gardening, or is it so that we can bring more people to the table? Is it for the skiers, or is it for people to get more involved at large? And did designers take into account, some of those more nuanced sides of what the community looks like, what are the community needs, and where resources can be best driven? And also, who's going to care for this infrastructure? Who's going to watch over the greenhouse during the summer months? Who's going to watch the groomer if you got one? I mean, that's a big piece of machinery. Where's it going to live all summer? Okay. And in going with that, they've got to be physically practical, culturally relevant, beneficial, and hopefully sustainable in some manner. And so with that, we just think it's important in many circumstances to consider how the built environment will modify behaviors, but also it's super critical, right, to understand that humans drive all of these changes at its core. It's not a brick in a building. It's not necessarily a ski, but it's a person that's interested in that can bring all parties together to really generate that change. And with that, we can open it up to questions.
So hello. I was actually really interested because we have this group of people here. Is this slide? Is this idea? I believe that what we're saying probably isn't blowing anyone's mind. It's sort of intuitive, right? That we need people involved in this, but it does seem like there's a disconnect when I talk to agency people and program people about projects that are happening versus when I talk to people who are on the ground, who are running programs and getting people outside. How come your school doesn't have, what happened to the wrestling program at your school? We lost the coach, right? Versus what are you spending? Well, we're buying more mats, right? And so it seems like there's a bit of a disconnect. And I did want to, it's a big group, but I really did want to ask that question or sort of call attention to that and see why we think that is. I'm hearing something very different from the people that are actually working with families and kids, and then it seems like where we're spending money. Does anyone feel brave, like they would want to shout something out? Insight on that? Am I off base there? Does it seem like that's happening? This is totally empirical, just what I've witnessed from.
Clinicians is not what's valued for communities. In my experience, I found it's like mixed methods. So we prefer communities, especially cultures that value oral tradition. They value qualitative data, the stories, that pieces, and also being able to give that information in terms of needs assessments back to communities. So if you're investing in stuff, well, we have evidence base that this stuff worked, and this stuff worked in the lower 48. Whereas I think in communities like in Alaska, we're much smaller. We have much more of a community focus. And so I think the people that are funding the stuff haven't caught up with what's really happening on the ground. And so unfortunately, they call the shots with funding, in my experience.
That's great. Okay. Yeah, that's a good insight. Anybody else have any?
We got one over here.
Oh.
I think it's hard to invest in the people. It's not like we are just able to. So for our community garden activity awards that YK offered for years, we're not able to pay people to do something. Our grant allowed people to purchase things. And so a teacher would come along and have a great idea for ski coup in the village, and we'd send whatever they needed for it. But we can't invest in the people, even in our own employer. We can't, say, well, here, I'll give you an extra $50 a day if you go out and coach kids. We can't do that. And the schools, it's the same thing. There isn't any ability to invest financially in the people to convince people to stay. And all across Alaska, we have that attrition problem.
Can just sort of follow up when you say you can't, because it's like a grant restriction or because it's logistically difficult, or what is?
Well, for the way our grants were offered before, it literally said you cannot pay a person to do something. So I'm not going to pay you, Leif, to come out and teach kids, because if I was sending you to a village, you're not going to stay in that village. So why am I going to pay you to go to Mountain Village?
Yeah.
You're not going to be there. You're not going to then invest in the community.
Yeah.
And that's how our grants were written. But I mean, it's no different than people that work for the corporations, I think, either.
I think that's a really good insight. And so I think when I talk to people and I say, hey, it's actually easier to build something than it is to get somebody to help with it. It's like, what? That doesn't make any sense. But that what you're saying is, yeah, I mean, it does. It's easier to get money to build a garden than it is to get somebody to plant a potato in it. And it's probably worth considering a little bit.
In some of the villages, it's really good to get the buy-in from the elders, because the elders, help can promote stuff like that. And there was a generation where a lot of this stuff didn't get done. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like,
I think with the gardening thing, that's something I definitely heard a lot. We're going to get elders and youth to work together. And it's like, okay, well, did anybody talk to the elders and the youth? Do they know that? So I wanted to hit, I'll turn back over in a second here. I wanted to hit this slide again and say, these are some examples that I really thought of when people who I've talked to. It's like, hey, how can we help make this successful? They're not, nobody's making the claim that, hey, if we had another 5 miles of bike trail in Anchorage, that's what's going to, turn our race program around, right? It's like, no, we need somebody to put up cones in the morning. That's what we need, right? Can you come put up cones in the morning? And, that's the hard part to get. And that's the challenge, right? And so I think that in the research world, there's an acceptance that the built environment is this huge driver for public health and can nudge people towards good behavior, right? And that the literature has been there for 20 years. And there is a contrast between what I'm seeing when I talk to people and what I'm seeing when I look around the state and what I'm reading in the journals about how, well, if we just build musical stairways, then that people will, take the stairs instead of the, right? And so, when you look at how the trails are getting used, if we have 8 soccer fields out at Kincaid, some people are going to show up and play soccer, right? Maybe kick a ball around with their family. But the days that those are packed, it's because there's a program there. There's soccer coaches, there's adults, and there's parents using that infrastructure. If we build a 9th soccer field at Kincaid, what is the marginal benefit of that? We don't need that, So, and I think that it's easy to talk about Anchorage where we have a lot of infrastructure, but that same thing carries into a lot of our smaller communities. Just about every school in the state has a gym, which means they could have volleyball, they could have basketball with some mats, they could have wrestling, right? Most communities in our state could do cross country. Do they do all those things? And if not, why? And the answer is always the same. We're looking for a coach. Can you help us? You're interested? Well, I'm not really cross country. It doesn't matter. Please show up. Do you have shoes? You're in. So that's what people are really hungry for when we look at this activity change is human beings.
can I ask a quick question of you? Over here on the side. I'm a passionate runner, skier. I came from Southeast Alaska. I'm here in Anchorage. I have a little kid. I'd love for her to do junior Nordic, but I work full time as a provider. So I think a built environment is the schedule of when things happen. And that's a real barrier for a lot of working families. I work at ANTHC where I have parents who are working multiple jobs. They can't be sitting at the computer to sign their kid up for junior Nordic because it's so popular. That's what you have to do. Or, thinking about how do we work with working parents and some of the other structures that keep people from being active, right? They just physically don't have enough time because they're trying to pay the bills. So you have your ear, so I want to share it. I think trying to make these programs school-based so that kids can do them without their parents is such an important value to our community. We also need more social programs supporting parents and young families so they can be active because people are strapped.
We also have the calendar alarm for the second that Junior Nordic opens. I feel your frustration there, but that's a great example, right? If we had another 5 miles of ski trail in Anchorage, would that solve that problem? Not at all, right? They need volunteers, they need coaches. That's what one coach calls in sick and it blows everything up. But much of the attention of like the Muni and our is like, well, how do we improve the ski trails? Speaking of Junior Nordic,
I'm not affiliated with the Junior Nordic program anymore. Going back kind of the question that was maybe 3 or 2 questions ago, in talking about, I could offer my staff $50 a day or whatever that offering is. That's still not, that's almost more built than it is the human capital aspect, right? It's kind of like we're going to throw money and things at something. What is more critical or maybe a more important piece of that is that, and it's much harder to develop, right? This is not a Band-Aid solution. It's much more in depth, is that the real change is going to occur when you're kind of changing the hearts and the minds, right? And so if I give Leif $50 to go coach, well, maybe he wants $50, but he probably doesn't care that much. He's doing pretty good. But he's going to come out and do it. But maybe if I work with Leif's kids, maybe I don't know their names. Let's say it's Sally. Maybe Sally loves skiing, right? And this is actually what I kind of saw. I did work for Junior Nordic for about 10 years. And this is what I saw in my most successful cases was maybe I've got Sally as a 7-year-old, and Sally is so stoked on skiing, and Sally keeps skiing every year. And I see Sally, 5 years later, now she's a hawk. She's skate skiing really fast. And then I see Sally a couple years later at Kincaid. She's skiing for her middle school team, right? And she's loving it still. She's not the best, but she loves it. And then I see Sally another couple of years down the line, and she's in high school, right? She's 16. She's probably looking for a part-time job, okay? And now I can get Sally, so I can go, hey, Tyler, are you hiring this year? I would like a job. I really enjoy this. What that has done is it's taken that wheel and it's spun it around. And so now Sally has gone from the individual that enjoyed the sport to becoming interested in carrying that on for the next season. This doesn't need to be skiing. This could be gardening. This could be biking, could be running. Doesn't frankly matter what you call it, but that's kind of the idea, is that really what you're doing is instilling a passion, and that passion can carry over to really drive some of those bigger built changes.
I would just like to add that, so let's say we achieve this objective out in some village. We get some high school kid who skis in high school, goes to WISA or goes to the championships in White Mountain, really loves skiing, and he'd love to coach. But can he afford to? Well, that's where the rub is. We need to be able to have some funding source that isn't restricted so that that person can make a living while doing the very thing we're just talking about, spinning the wheel and passing on the love of getting outdoors and playing in the snow.
We have one over here. Are there training programs or some kind of a learning piece for people who feel like they could learn or that they want to coach or help, but they're terrified of it and not sure what to do about it? Because, I mean, people who've never coached before could really hurt kids too.
So kind of, I'm assuming you're kind of going for skiing on that one. Anything? Sure. I think we could probably apply it across the board, right? Yes, training is like super key, right? Like, especially we don't want to teach kids a wrong body movement that's going to cause them injury later in life, right? That would be terrible. But what we do want is to drive like a passion. And so oftentimes Skiku runs its program through about 100 volunteers, a little over that every winter. It's a lot of people, and we're generally always recruiting, right? And so I've got friends that may not be skiers, put that in quotes, right, themselves, but they like working with kids, okay? And so I'm not out going to APU and Winter Stars. These are like elite clubs in town, right? I'm not recruiting my volunteer base from those. I'm recruiting my volunteer base from people who like working with kids, right? And so kind of if I get somebody that's a second grade teacher and she goes, oh, I'd really like to do that, but man, I am a terrible skier. Well, I can teach you how to ski. That is super easy. What I can't do is I can't teach you to like kids or to pass on a fun experience to kids that makes them want to come back to do that activity again the next time and again the year after. So kind of to that end, it's a little more specific, but yes, we do offer a coach's orientation. And to that end too, when I'm working with volunteers, especially if they're new to me and they request like, hey, could we just go out for an hour? Yeah, let's go out for an hour. I'm happy to kind of make sure your skate skiing is on lock enough to play wolves and caribou.
I think that kind of ties things together pretty well, though. I mean, because that, if we look at, say, the pool in Bethel, right? A very expensive facility, right? And what's the bottleneck right there is swim instructors and lifeguards. And it's people, right? It's people to work there, and they do pay those people. But how do you encourage people to do that and want to do that and want to take those jobs? And so to some extent, money solves some of those problems, but not all of them. There are some jobs we just can't seem to fill, right? So I think overarching here, kind of the point is that those pieces of human capital are difficult. That's why they're problems, and they're worth attention. So if that means spending time and resources on training, or if it just means spending time and resources on understanding what the barriers are, that is probably time well spent, because we won't be successful without it, right? And that is hard to do from a programmatic standpoint, to say, hey, what I want to do is have a community meeting. I want to buy some pizza and sit down with people, and that's tough. I understand why that doesn't always look great on an annual report, but it is, I think, key to success, and based on what we're seeing. Question.
I had just a comment that this has made me think of. Allie Moe, I'm a primary care provider. Just with human capital being so important for our institutions and for public health, and yet in this state, we're kind of in a crisis of retention for public service and for teaching, because we do not provide a sustainable retirement program. And so how can you have somebody in the schools who's able to build a program and sustain it and pass it on if they're only here for 2 years? Like, as you said, it doesn't work. And so I think this is also just a reminder of, supporting our public institutions, who often are parks and recs, our schools. It really is important for our health of our communities and our public health.
I think part of it is that extra challenging piece that I was a little bit speaking to a second ago, which is trying to drive that passion within it internally in the community. Would I love it if teachers would stay in the schools they're in for a long time? Yeah, that would be so awesome for like all of the reasons, right? But to point to your example, yeah, it's real. Those teachers in a lot of locations are flipping even at semester, right? And so it's very challenging for me to invest in training for that individual, knowing the odds of them flipping at semester are pretty high. What we love to see at Skiku, at least, is that passion, while we like to work very closely with the school, and while I'm a big fan of schools, what we really like to see is partnership at the community and long-term resident level. And so, yes, it is awesome and imperative to work with schools, but what's also imperative is recognizing that some of those populations are pretty transient, whereas your local community members and your elders are probably going to be there for a while, and that is a good place to make some of those long-term investments back into the community potentially.
As someone who's participated in a community-based ski program in the past, I just wanted to mention that for every expert skier that is needed to help in the community program, you need 3 or 4 community volunteers who are willing to do things like make sure that the kids' boots fit, make sure that they don't ski away from the starting area without their gloves and mittens. Do they have the proper clothing on? This does not require any kind of athletic expertise, but it does require involvement.
As a parent with active children, I mean, we get hit up for that stuff all the time. We need someone to collect jerseys. We need somebody to put up cones. We need someone to stand over there and tell us if there's a moose, right? So but it's all time.
Over here.
In the small communities, how do we get started with that if we live in a village? Like, how would we get started with cross-country skiing with you guys? How would that work?
I would say I'm not sure where everyone is from in this room. For every different place, I could probably give you a different answer. It's highly variable. What oftentimes, so tomorrow we'll launch our community application. It'll pretty much go to all the schools that I have a history of working with, but oftentimes going with that can be a pretty transient population. I will probably get about a 50% bounce back when I send that. And then I will try to reach tribes based on the contacts that I have, but I will get another big slew of bounce backs. And for schools that have never had us come, well, I have no contact. Ideally, if you guys have never had us come catch me after this. But for the most part, we have a pretty rapid application. It's just a Google form, and it just says, hey, we're X community. This is the flight carrier. This is how many students we have. There's a couple other questions, and then the week that you want us to come, because we want to make sure we're not overlapping testing or NYO games, or maybe half the school is going to go to Disneyland. I don't know. It's all different, right? But just making sure it's a good schedule. We try to work really closely with the schools in this case, because they know their schedules often better than anyone else. And then in terms of ski equipment, over the years, we've sprinkled a lot of skis across the state, like lots and lots and lots. It makes me very sad when I go to a place and they're covered in dust, because there's that teacher that took them out 2 years ago. Well, they left 2 years ago. And so they're only getting used the week we're there. But that being said, we do also bring gear for new communities, especially if they're smaller. Like we'll bring in like 3 or 4 full of skis. And then depending on circumstances, we might leave a whole bunch. We might partner with that community to help do some grant writing on their behalf so that they're able to kind of, in effect, buy them through us. There's kind of an array of things. That's why I say maybe catch me after. But we try to work very closely with the community and then with the school as well, just to make sure it's all dialed in.
Add one general comment to that, which is, again, just something that I've observed as someone who has traveled and taught in villages all over the state. Having somebody local is a great place to start. So start by talking to the community, because the places where things like this are successful is when there's somebody to meet us when we get off the plane and knows where we're going to stay and knows who to introduce us to. The times where it's less successful is when somebody sets it up and, well, I'm not going to be here because I got to go visit my family. But you just go to the school, they'll set you up, right? Or just, you'll find it. So I would actually take a step back and say, if we wanted to get started with any kind of, I'm guessing it's similar with skiing, right? Skiing's probably not special in that way, is starting in the community and say, who wants this to happen? Who's going to kind of shepherd this process through? Because that's certainly what I have seen for years, is the villages where I have success and I have a good audience and things go well and I want to go back to every time, are the ones where I know somebody there. I know they're going to kind of help integrate me when I get off the plane with my backpack and I'm don't know which way the clinic is or whatever.
And especially that piece of that person is already interested. Like maybe somebody, I'm not sure where you were at, but maybe someone is like, yeah, I am stoked on skiing. You see them every day from December through April and they're out on the river or wherever they are, but they're the only one, but man, they are into it. Maybe that's a good one to build up. Because ideally too, as we're traveling across the state doing this, in a lot of places, I don't find out where the skiers are, the elders, or some of those kids' parents that used to race in 1983, like that yearbook picture. I don't know about them till Friday, and by then I'm leaving in a couple hours, and it's too late for me to have formed that. But there was no one helped make that connection. Whereas if that connection could have been made, it could have been a much more productive week.